Hi, I'm here with Brett Fishburne, and we are going to talk about a MakerSpace program, which is the Thoughtful Discussion Group. So hi Brett, tell me what the Thoughtful Discussion Group is and what some of the rules are.
Sure. The Thoughtful Discussion Group is a group that meets once a week for 2 hours. And we have very simple rules. The first rule is no politics, and the second rule is no religion. This doesn't mean you can have a glancing discussion of politics or a glancing discussion of religion, but they can't be the answer because they end the discussion.
It's a great way to keep things civil. So Brett, can you tell me what the topic of discussion was this past week?
Briefly stated, the topic was, should we rebuild? And it was sort of inspired by the fire at Notre Dame. And the question of, is it appropriate to rebuild a monument that has been destroyed in some way?
So I imagine were there strong feelings either way on this?
No, this was just a considered discussion. We didn't have anybody take a particularly strong opinion, and we didn't have anybody take a devil's advocate opinion to sort of forward the discussion.
Is it simply a matter of rebuilding, or are there other things that you considered in your conversation?
So yeah, we considered several layers. One is, do you want to rebuild things? The simple case. The other is maybe rebuilding just isn't appropriate at all. Maybe something should be allowed to crumble and revert to nature for future archaeologists or whomever else might come across it, or to provide space for other use.
I'm wondering, but I guess in the case of Notre Dame, it is a national symbol, so I'm sure that they are going to rebuild. And so what other examples would you look at to just make the discussion go?
Well, starting with Notre Dame, it is a national symbol, and it's the most tourist-driven place in all of Europe. So there was a real incentive to rebuild it. We also looked at, for example, the Veterans Memorial here in Greenbelt, which doesn't have any tourist or economic reasons to be rebuilt if it were destroyed by, say, an asteroid or meteor. We tried to look at, sometimes things just have meaning to the community in which they live. And Stonehenge was another example of something that had a combination of meaning, but it also had a use. It was used to determine when to plant, when to harvest, and things like that. So things like that would probably be rebuilt as well because they're needed for their use. We extended the discussion further to talk about, say, Shakespeare, the place where Shakespeare was born. One of the members of the discussion group had recently been to Avon and stood on the hallowed boards, and really was moved going back and standing in the same place Shakespeare had stood, and pondered whether or not it would feel the same way if we knew it had been burned down and rebuilt. This particular person felt that it would not be the same experience, whereas others in the group argued that it would be the same for them, that they could still look on the vistas that Shakespeare saw, framed by the windows that are remakes of what was there. So we kind of went back and forth on the whole general idea of does rebuilding something change it, or does it replace it? And maybe it does both. When we were talking about the Veterans Memorial here in Greenbelt, one of the suggestions was maybe it would be rebuilt and something would be added to it, or it would be in some way changed to make it more local, more current. Maybe the kids at Roosevelt would be asked to come up with a new design or something like that, where the concept would remain the same, but it wouldn't be an effort to duplicate what was already there.
One example that comes to mind for me is some of the cities in Europe that were destroyed in World War II. And I visited Warsaw, and the old town was rebuilt. I was perfectly fine with it, but other people said, this is the Disney version of Old Town. Yeah. And I guess other places that are destroyed are rebuilt. I'm okay with the rebuild myself. But another part of me is like, there's the Buddhist idea of impermanence, and if it's gone, it's gone, and don't cry. Just, move on.
Well, so one of our group had recently been to Germany, and I can't remember which city he had been in, but he pointed out that there were several cities that had just a church that had been bombed out, that was sort of left as a memorial. And this also happened in Japan.
Yep.
And so the rest of the city is glittering and new because, frankly, it was razed. But this old church remains as a memory of how things had been. And so it actually had a symbolism that went beyond just leaving it the way it was. By virtue of being the way it was itself a symbol.
It's to me, a very poignant symbol, made all the more so because of the contrast between the ruin and the brand new glittering high rises around it. Yeah.
Exactly the point that was made. So sometimes you don't want it to be rebuilt. Sometimes you don't want it to decay. Sometimes you want to just leave it the way it was. And so then the question was raised, well, what happens if there's another war and it is subsequently bombed again? Do you rebuild it back to what it was for World War II? And that was just, just a broad discussion.
So what are some of the other topics that you are looking forward to discussing with the group?
Well, at the end of each meeting, we pick the topic for the next meeting. So we don't have planned topics ahead of time. We generally do topics on a catch-as-catch-can basis. So that way everybody is invested, and we give a chance for everybody to sort of pick a topic that might interest them. We also sort of bang around topics. Sometimes a topic needs to be revisited several times. One time, the next topic we're going to have at the next discussion group is going to involve what is the realm of your privacy? How large is your privacy? And the example that was brought up was an article in the newspaper about a man who was standing in front of a window naked in a hotel room 30 floors up, was arrested for indecent exposure. And so the question became, well, where was his privacy? Because the concept of indecent exposure is that you're showing your genitals in public. So standing in your hotel room, is that public?
30 floors up.
Right.
Which, I would consider the public on the ground. And
Well,
if you're across from me in the building,
yeah, and so
maybe you shouldn't be looking.
That's the nature of the discussion, is trying to figure out what the nuances are and how you would even know. As an average individual, how would you know whether you were in public or not?
I'm reading in the New York Times, and they're doing a big series this week on internet privacy and how we've given it away, and in ways that we're not even aware of. That even if you believe that you're discreet on the internet, there are networks that fan out from you so that they can infer many things about you from your friends who are very active on the internet.
Yeah. In fact, early on in the process of doing this sort of thing, one of the major retailers sort of tried to track people so they could tailor their coupons and their advertisements to the individual's needs. And it got to such a point where they were so effective at this that they were sending women information about maternity and Pampers and that sort of thing before they even realized they themselves were pregnant.
Whoa.
So it's remarkably insulting to be treated this way and then discover you're pregnant and then to think, oh my God, Walmart knew. Additionally, the concept of privacy on the internet, who owns the data? By what right does any organization gather your data and, even more importantly, resell it?
Right, sell it and track you and...
Well, it's your product.
Yeah.
Your data is your product, and yet Google sells it. What if they came into your house and took your shirt and sold it? That would be a huge problem.
Yeah.
Both taking the shirt and selling it, right? And yet somehow we don't seem to have the same sense of ownership of our own data on the internet.
There's one of the concerns is that China has learned to track and control its people, and they are now exporting their technology to other countries, and they're finding that the Chinese police state is part of what is being exported.
I don't know what to say about that.
Right. Yeah.
It sounds like a good thing to talk about. How do your exports affect the world? One might argue that we export death in the form of missiles and jets and things like that. Or you might argue we export health in the form of aid to other countries and things like that. We might also export intellectual capabilities, like the concept of a successful democracy, and things like that. So I think it's not an easy discussion, and it is easy to point fingers and find individual areas that might be a problem.
I've got to tell you, personally, I wish that I could just go like this. I don't feel like I have anything to hide, but I also don't want 40 companies knowing all about me and talking about it and profiting off it.
Well, so I understand where you're coming from, and this will be part of our discussion next week. You should consider attending. But one of the things you might want to think about is when our forefathers, the founding fathers of the country, who did many things poorly and some things well, when they considered this at the time, everybody knew everybody's business, right? If you lived in a village, much like Greenbelt, except instead of 30,000 people, there were 300. You knew everybody in that village, and you knew everything that happened with everybody in that village. Now, you can't hide out like you could maybe in the 1960s in a metropolitan society like Greenbelt, because your traces are all over the internet. So there could be good things and could be bad things that go with that. Good things, there could be societal oversight. Bad things, there could be societal abuse. And that's the kind of thing we discuss. We don't come in with an opinion. We come in to discuss it and sort of apply some intellectual rigor to the concept rather than trying to come to a conclusion.
Great. So Brett, thank you. Can you tell me how often and where the group meets?
Every Tuesday from 7 to 9, we meet in the community center, and you'll be able to find us on the whiteboard under Greenbelt MakerSpace. We don't always end up in the same room.
Great. See you then.
See you then.
Thanks.